Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington. This is our finale for the Ghost Stories of Washington series, Chapter 8, Phantoms with a Mission, Part 3. Dead Ringer, Grisly-looking ghost, cousin bids adieu, meets with approval, and a ghost with a purpose. Those are our 5 stories for this finale edition of Ghost Stories of Washington. In our first story, Dead Ringer, sometimes the messages we receive from beyond the veil are so subtle that we are only faintly aware of their transmission. We don't see an image, hear a disembodied voice, or really notice anything much out of the ordinary. Anything that is except an inexplicable urge to visit a particular place, or perhaps a strong feeling urges us not to leave home on a certain day, we may rush to label as intuition, what is actually a communication from the spirit world. What is that? I thought there was a ghost on the screen with me. In the spring of 1864, Peggy and Harold Carey were embarking on an adventure. Harold, an engineer, had just accepted a commission in San Francisco. The position required that he live in the city, so he and Peggy set out to drive to the Bay Area from their home in Delaware. Not surprisingly, they had carefully planned their route long before the date of departure. Harold was surprised, therefore, when some miles into the journey, Peggy asked if they could visit Seattle. The city was considerably further north than they had planned on going, but they had plenty of time, so Harold readily agreed. The drive down the coast will be gorgeous, Peggy assured her husband, and I'm afraid that if we don't see Seattle on this trip, we never will. Somehow, not seeing that city just seems like a terrible shame to me. Without further discussion on the topic, the couple plotted their course anew and continued along. They arrived in Seattle on a Saturday and were delighted with their first impression of the city. Peggy was especially full of enthusiasm and kept suggesting that they take one turn or another, just to see where the road ahead would lead them. When they drove slowly past a small neighborhood shopping center, Peggy suddenly became agitated. "Stop the car, Harold," she pleaded. Surprised, the man steered the car to the curb and watched in confusion as his wife jumped out of the car. Scurrying around to the driver's side, she tugged the door open. "See that church across the street? The sign out front is advertising a flea market for this afternoon. Let's go poke around for some bargains," Peggy suggested. Although his wife's behavior was peculiar, her enthusiasm was contagious. Harold joined her immediately. The basement room in the church was lined with tables covered with all manner of items, large and small. As they directed an irresistible force, Peggy moved directly to one particular stand, where she lost no time picking out a plain gold ring from a basket of trinkets. "How much for this?" she asked the woman standing behind the table. "I'd like to get $5 for it, but if you're willing to give that much, you can have it for whatever you think it's worth," the vendor replied. Silently, Peggy handed over a $5 bill. Turning to her husband, and she said simply, "Okay, Harold, we can go now." Later that afternoon, the couple checked into the motel just south of Seattle. After enjoying a leisurely dinner, they returned to their room to get ready for an early bedtime. They wanted to be refreshed for an early start on the next leg of their trip the next morning. Just to have something to do, Peggy took her new jewelry purchase out of her purse and began to polish it. Suddenly, she cried, "My God in heaven, I don't believe it. I don't believe it." "What's the matter?" her husband asked with a mixture of concern and irritation in his voice. Peggy's outburst had startled him. "Read the inscription inside this ring, Harold," Peggy demanded. "I've just bought my own mother's wedding ring, the one that was stolen before she died. She had been promising it to me ever since I was a little girl. The ring was even in her will, but by the time she passed away, it had been gone for nearly 10 years, even though circumstances dictated that she had to do it silently and unseen from beyond the grave. Peggy's mother made sure that she kept her promise to her beloved daughter." That's an interesting ghost story for sure for the last episode here today. In our next story, Grisly Looking Ghost. If you should ever happen to be out walking in Stillicum on a dark, stormy night, you may cross paths with the ghost of a certain Mr. Bates. The wandering apparition of J.M. Bates has haunted several areas of Stillicum for more than a century and a half. The spectral presence is harmless, unless one counts the inevitable fright that Bates's ghost gives people when they first see him. There's no denying that he is a grisly enough sight to give anyone a start. With that, the hangman's rope and noose that strangled him still dangling from his neck. But you really need not fear, because the poor deceased man means no harm. When he was alive, J.M. Bates was a pauper and a simple man. He certainly didn't have a lot, but he did need much. After all, he lived in one of the most naturally beautiful spots in the country during uncomplicated times. Bates' only possession was a cow, and he treasured this animal above all else. One day Bates discovered that his beloved cow was missing. Sick at heart and raging with anger, Bates ran to the main street, in which those days was lined with saloons, knowing that most of the men in town would recognize his distinctive cow. Bates began asking if anyone had seen the beast. It wasn't long before someone volunteered that he had noticed a wealthy man named Andrew Bird was walking beside an animal that bore a strong resemblance to Bates's missing cow. Bates caught up with the accused on the street and confronted him with the allegation. Bird expressed no guilt and claimed to have no knowledge whatsoever of the theft. His denials only succeeded in inflaming Bates's anger further. In a rage, J.M. Bates drew his gun and shot Andrew Bird. As Bird lay dying, he pleaded with those who had gathered around him not to punish Bates for the crime. It was Bates's simplicity and anger that made a murderer of him. The fatally injured man protested, but J.M. was not a bad man. The crowd was not nearly as magnanimous as the victim had been. Just moments after Andrew Bird passed over to the great beyond, J.M. Bates was arrested and thrown into the Starling Street cells. Some hours later, a mob of vigilantes broke into the jail and captured its sole inmate. They bound the man's hands and feet and put a gag in his mouth and threw him on the back of a horse and rode directly to the woods with their prisoner. When they came to a suitable tree, they hanged the defenseless man. The very next day, Bates's cow was seen grazing at the side of the railroad track. Shortly after that first sighting, word began to spread through the town that the man who had originally persuaded Bates to believe that Bird was a thief had fled. The townspeople were finally able to piece together the whole story. 2 wronged men were dead, and the only truly guilty party had escaped to freedom. Bird's soul must have passed peacefully into the afterlife, because no one has ever seen his spirit. Bates's ghost, however, with the bloodiest noose still hanging from his broken neck, had been seen wandering the streets. Most of those who have witnessed the apparition say he seems to be on an eternal search for his much adored cow. In our next story, Cousin Bids Adieu. A man whom we shall simply call Don lives in the pretty south central community of Richland. Don has lived a full and varied life, a life that has even included one extraordinary, profound ghost sighting. The incident occurred early in the morning of November 15th, 1971. I clearly saw the face of my cousin near the foot of my bed, Don exclaimed. He said, "Don, I have died." Then his face disappeared. As far as I knew at the time, my cousin was alive and well. Understandably troubled by what he had experienced, Don said nothing about his vision. 4.5 hours after my psychic experience, the mail arrived. In the mail was a letter from my cousin's widow. Don did not have to open the envelope to know what the message contained in it. His cousin had died 1 week earlier. All right, and our next story meets with approval. Stan Towers of Yakima was a devoted son in the early 1960s. His father, who was then quite elderly, was dying. Stan looked after the old man with great affection until his father's condition became too severe to be treated at home. Even after his father had been moved to a comfortable nursing facility and began receiving competent round-the-clock care, Stan visited as often as he possibly could. The young man's devotion was even more admirable, considering that he was, during those same months, also dating Nancy, the woman who would eventually become his wife. As is the case with many courting couples, the pair felt much unsaid. Stan spoke of his father so fondly and so frequently that Nancy longed to meet him. Because she did not wish to intrude, however, she kept her eagerness to herself. Ironically, Stan very much wanted to introduce Nancy to his father, but didn't wish to impose on her. Sadly, Mr. Towers died before the two young people were completely comfortable communicating with one another. As a result, the two most important people in Stan Towers' life never met, at least not when they were both alive. Several days after the funeral, the deceased man and his future daughter-in-law first laid eyes on one another. Stan had taken Nancy to see the house he had just inherited. As the couple sat chatting together in the living room, they were startled to realize that they had both heard a third voice. Its humorous tone was distinct, Nancy recalled, but the words were not. I glanced toward the hall, and there he was, Stan's father. The apparition stared at Nancy for a few seconds before smiling at her and then melting away. Both Stan and Nancy realized that his father had come back to make their unspoken wishes come true. Nancy and her father-in-law had met, despite the usually effective twin obstacles of shyness and death. Stan and Nancy are pseudonyms. Their real names are in my files. All other details of the events are reported exactly as they occurred. Right. And then, with our last story in this episode and in the closing of Ghost Stories of Washington, a ghost with a purpose. On a Friday the 13th, in the early spring of 1940, Earl, Don, and Harold Willits set out together for the mountains of the Cascade Range to climb a peak known as Three Fingers. The young men had grown up in the area, not far from Mount Pilchuck, and were experienced climbers. Their planned trek on this occasion would total nearly 30 miles of hiking and climbing. So they decided to head out in the evening, camp overnight, and complete both the climb and the descent at a leisurely pace on Saturday. It was 7:30 in the evening when they parked their car near Boulder Creek, each wearing a backpack and carrying an axe. The trio set out on the first part of their hike. By 10 p.m., they had found an ideal spot at which to spend the night. An abandoned lean-to, complete with a set of 4 bunk beds. Earl Willets took one of the top bunks and found that there were so many cracks in the roof of the old structure that his head, resting on the pillow, he had a clear view of the night sky. He remembers watching patches of white fog rise in eerie swirls from the ponds that lay in the valley. Earl fell asleep, enjoying the unusual perspective. It was several hours later, Earl estimated, that he awoke with a spine-jolting start. Every nerve in my body tingled, he recalled, although at the time I had no idea why he should be in such a state. Seconds later, he opened his eyes and stared right at the reason for his sudden flood of feeling. There, floating directly above him as he lay on the top bunk, was the disembodied face of a man. Understandably shaken, Earl had only a moment to size up the features that were peering intently at his own. He estimated that the features were those of a man of about 20. The face had several days' growth of beard, but the most striking feature was its pair of deep blue eyes. They were made even more striking by the fact that the apparition's face was also blue. Judging from its pinched nostrils and white mouth, the blue hue had been caused by extreme cold. "Can I help you?" Earl asked the image. With that, the ghostly face vanished. Earl did not get back to sleep that night. He was too puzzled by what he had seen and too absorbed with pondering the possible significance of the sighting. Earl was afraid that someone was in mortal danger and was trying to, perhaps in the only way he could, to get the attention of the men in the lean-to. At breakfast, Earl told his brothers about the experience. They were both sure that he had dreamed the whole episode, but Earl knew better. The brothers broke camp and proceeded on their way to the summit. After hiking a distance of roughly 7 miles, they met up with a stranger. The man advised them to change their route. The one they had planned to climb was far too dangerous at this time of year. He offered to guide the Willets through the alternative route. The brothers happily accepted the man's offer. The ranger, chatting amiably while they climbed, explained why he had been posted in the area. Apparently, another group had tried to climb that very trail that the brothers had been headed toward. One member of that party had lost his footing and slid to his death at the bottom of a crevice. Earl whirled around to face the ranger. "What did that person look like?" he demanded. The ranger explained that the climber had likely died on impact, and that by the time the rescue party had reached the poor man, he didn't look pretty. Despite the man's caution, Earl insisted on a description. He was about 20 years old, and he had about a week's growth of beard and the bluest eyes I've ever seen. The 3 brothers stopped in their tracks. Without speaking, they all came to the conclusion that they now had an explanation for Earl's strange vision of the night before. Surely the young man's spirit had come back to warn the brothers not to travel on, that it was too dangerous, and that they too might lose their lives. The 3 men thanked the ranger for his kindness and told him that they had decided to head back to their base camp for now. Perhaps they would try the climb to 3 Fingers on another occasion. Not many hours later, an enormous avalanche crashed down from the peak they had been heading toward. Had the Willets brothers not interpreted and heeded the ghost's warning, they would have met their certain death. Hopefully you've enjoyed this reading of Ghost Stories of Washington. And I will give you a little heads up. We will be resuming these ghost stories and doing Ghost Stories of Yellowstone and now Ghost Stories of Washington. I'm getting nice comments back from those that do watch these episodes. So I will continue the series, but I'm going to take the rest of the summer off, and in the fall we will resume with another one. I'll be posting a poll on my community tab in my YouTube channel, and if you do watch this series, make sure you cast your vote, and please leave me a comment too to all of my videos in my the Yellowstone series and the Ghost Stories of Washington. And if I get enough comments and reviews on this content series, I will continue ghost stories of different areas within the United States, possibly even Canada. Okay, so until then, it's been fun presenting and preparing this series for you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we will see you in the fall when I resume with another series of ghost stories. Okay, so before the end of this month, or sometime this month, I will put up a poll for which ghost stories type we should do next. Okay, so until then, have a wonderful and blessed summer, and we'll see you in the autumn for this continuing series and another book of ghost stories. Take care, and we'll see you around YouTube. Bye for now.